It's good to be back. My apologies for missing a week. I was touring with my wife Suna's trio, so I have a good excuse. But I naively thought I would be able to record an episode on the road. It proved more difficult than I expected. There was a lot of travel going between 5 countries, but it's so nice to get to play multiple gigs with the same band. That actually ties in nicely with this week's episode topic: repetition. When we get to perform repeatedly, no matter what it is, if we're touring with a band or doing a play or designing the branding for a bakery or baking a cake, whatever it is, if we get to do it repeatedly, it's only going to get better. With Suna's trio, we have a head start because we've been playing together for over a decade, playing each other's music and developing a rapport that can only happen over time. And when we did the first concert of this tour, we had already performed the previous week at a festival in Iceland, so it was kind of like the second gig of the tour. But still, even just by playing twice in a row, we could notice the difference. Of course, the excitement of being in a new place with a new audience is also a factor, but playing a set of music repeatedly and sensing the comfort level of the band as a whole increasing with each concert is something that can only happen with that kind of steady repetition. So today I want to get into the role of repetition in creativity, how it can inspire us, and how it can be a great thing to interrupt a pattern. Let's get started. So repetition can be really boring. And I know you've heard this again and again, but if you're enjoying the video, please take a moment and give it a thumbs up and go ahead and subscribe while you're at it. If you're new here, welcome to Keep the Flow. I'm Scott McLemore, a drummer and composer living way up north in Iceland, and I make these videos every week to look under the hood of the creative process to keep our creative engines humming. Is my hat straight? All right, let's do this. Right, so yes, repetition can be really boring. Doing the same thing over and over again can be like the most torturous thing in the world, especially if you're neurodivergent like some of us. But if it's something you're interested in, it can be amazing. I'm not an athletic person, generally speaking. Yes, I still ride a skateboard and go skiing a few times a year, but I'm just okay at both. However, there's an element of adventure in both of these. That might have been what attracted me to them. I got a little plastic skateboard when I was really young, like maybe 7 or 8, and I begged my parents for what I thought was a real skateboard until they finally gave in when I was around 10. I tried to get my sister to try it, which landed her in the emergency room with a broken wrist. I guess it's not for everyone. Still feel bad about that. But as a kid, I spent so many hours riding a skateboard, pretty much all my free time, until I got a drum set. Why didn't I get better at it? It seemed I was just content to just ride around and I had a few basic tricks, but that was it. There was a brief period when I got interested in tennis. I even took some lessons, but the repetition of hitting a ball over the net again and again, or just playing against a backboard, was so boring to me. Golf I could have probably gotten into, but then I remember my dad taking me to the driving range once, and I still can't get my mind around how people can just stand there and hit these little balls into the field over and over and somehow derive some enjoyment from that. But with a skateboard, it was something about it taking me to different places that I loved. I wasn't crazy about skate parks, although I did that some. But standing in one place and trying to land a new trick over and over was not appealing to me. Although to get better at something, you have to try things over and over and fail repeatedly. Repetition is how we learn. It's how we create neural pathways in our brain. It's how skills are developed. Somehow music was different for me. On the skateboard, I could go to different places and the scenery was constantly changing. With music, my internal scenery was changing. I was able to go to places in my mind. Still, playing patterns on the drums over and over was hard for me, especially if it wasn't particularly interesting. I started making up my own patterns, or basically composing on the drums. I had no idea what I was doing, but that's what worked for me. As I got older and more serious about music, I realized the importance of being able to play rudiments, as we call them, which are basically patterns between both hands, like right, left, right, left, right, left, left. And the only way to learn them is by doing them again and again. When I was in college, I made this connection and realized that practicing these quieted my mind. It becomes kind of like a meditation. The pattern or rudiment becomes a mantra. And it also gave me a lot more control and confidence on the instrument. But creativity is not a repetitive skill. I mean, yes, we do have to come up with new ideas over and over. So in that sense, it is repetitive. And yes, being creative is something we can also practice. But in the more immediate sense, one act of creativity can be vastly different than the next. We're not creating the same ideas over and over. Creativity is the realm where we use the skills we gained from all the repetitive practice. But if we step back and look at repetition from a wider perspective, if we zoom out, we see that creativity also exists in the repetition. When an artist draws the same shape over and over, there are imperfections, variations, expression, even when we're trying not to. There's a great quote from Al Pacino when asked about his theater work and doing the same play again and again. He said, "Repetition keeps me green. It's in the repetition that the creation comes." When we come back, we'll look at some examples of repetition in creativity and how we can utilize some of these approaches. Thanks for making it this far. If you're enjoying the video, please take a moment to give it a thumbs up and go ahead and subscribe while you're at it. I'm making videos like this every week. Well, I'm trying to. But hit the bell too so you don't miss out on any new episodes. A quick note about the tour I just came from. We met so many nice people along the way, and it's easy to take it for granted. As a traveling musician, you meet all kinds of people. But I was thinking about the first tour I did with my own band after being pretty much stuck on this island in the North Atlantic throughout the pandemic. I remember walking out on stage in Vienna at the first concert. The feeling I had was almost like starting over, looking out at the people in the audience. But I could feel their presence in a way that I hadn't since I was 17 years old playing in a rock band. I try to remember that now every time I perform. And when I meet people along the way, I treasure those moments. It's that connection between the audience and the performer that makes the whole thing possible. So I want to say hi to all the new people following me on Patreon, both paid patrons and free members. That's right, now you can follow on Patreon for free. Of course, you don't get the same exclusive content, but I do post stuff regularly there that everyone can see. For instance, my new series, Hiking with Penny, is visible to everyone there. Those are short videos I make during hikes with my dog Penny, where I talk about random stuff, usually ideas for future episodes of Keep the Flow. And if you do opt in for a paid tier for as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to podcast episodes, extended interviews, and bonus content. So definitely go check that out at patreon.com/ScottMcLemore. And now, back to Keep the Flow. Refine, evolve, emphasize, and deviate. These are 4 ways we can use repetition in our own work. Getting good at anything requires repetition. But I think it's easy to forget how useful repetition can be as we become more experienced. I was at a rehearsal the other day, and the saxophonist suggested we all play the melody in unison over and over, until we all knew it perfectly. What happened was the tune went in a new direction because we all started to hear it differently. It morphed into a more broad interpretation of the original piece as we repeated it. I'm not an actor, as you probably have gathered by now, but I've noticed in interviews with actors that they mention this phenomenon in the theater, like what Al Pacino said. It's in the repetition that the creation comes. As a cast performs together night after night, and sometimes matinee shows, it's grueling, I tell you. The cast members are all trying their best to hit their marks, say their lines, and express something. Each character is a whole world unto itself, and the actors playing them are living, breathing human beings with all sorts of stuff going on. But they're trying to focus like a laser on bringing this character to life, to make them real for a brief time. There's a kind of magic in that. But there are subtle differences from night to night. in tone, in posture. Nothing drastic, but even the most slight pause in a line, a look, a movement, can affect the performance of the rest of the cast. Almost like ripples in a pond, the effect of a small pebble can travel far. The repetition allows for this. It allows the actors to perceive the subtlety. We can also use repetition to emphasize. Martin Luther King used a literary device called anaphora in his I Have a Dream speech. Anaphora means a repeated refrain at the beginning of phrases that can provide emphasis, form, and rhythm. The combination of that phrase and the building intensity of his tone, not to mention the content, makes this speech one of the most inspiring in history. But the use of anaphora at the beginning of phrases and epistrophe at the end of phrases can be found in all sorts of writing, from speeches to scripts, poetry to prose. The repetition works almost like a key to our brains. It organizes ideas to make them more impactful because our brains have an easier time making sense of them. As artists, we can use the repetition as a device. It ties things together. It connects with audiences. Our brains love patterns, symmetry, the rule of thirds. Repetition gives us a way to organize our expression. Kandinsky's concentric circles, Andy Warhol's pop art, Steve Reich's minimalist music, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, it's everywhere. But repetition also gives us an opportunity to deviate. Swiss graphic designer Josef Müller-Brockmann is known for his grid systems and highly organized approach to layout. However, I think his best work is when he chooses an element to break the grid. For instance, on a poster, he will set up a clear, clean layout with a perceived grid indicated by typographic elements. And he'll take one visual element, like a photo or a shape, and have it transcend the grid. This relieves tension and brings in a more organic flow. The combination is really pleasing to the eye. The rule of thirds is commonly known, especially among photographers, as a way to compose an image. If we divide the frame into 3 equal sections, both vertically and horizontally, we end up with 9 rectangles. Using this grid in photography is an almost surefire way to create a visually pleasing composition. But when I think about the rule of thirds, it reminds me of the 12-bar blues. Typically, if you see a blues written out, it's in 3 lines of 4 bars each, not 9 bars. But still, it's divided into 3 parts. I have a tune on my album Knowing that's called Everything is a Moment, which is 15 bars long. But it's divided into 3 phrases, which repeat. The extra bar in each line gives an extended feeling but retains that rule of thirds effect. So the repetition isn't necessarily about doing the exact same thing repeatedly, but doing similar things. Organizing our work into sections allows the audience to perceive it in a way that fits with their brains. But just like Müller-Brockmann, when we transcend the grid, it has much more impact. Deviating from a pattern can be especially effective. If you remember the game Duck, Duck, Goose, which I don't know if that's a universal thing. Maybe there are different versions of it in different countries. Anyway, what I remember is all the kids sit in a circle on the floor. One walks around and taps each one on the head and says, duck. But if they say goose, whoever they tapped has to get up and chase them around the circle and try to catch them before they can sit down in their place. I remember the tension was incredible. Everyone waiting and listening so intensely. And when we heard goose, it was like everything went crazy for a minute. It's just a silly game, but the repetition builds anticipation, tension. When there is deviation from the pattern, it releases the tension, but we can also use this anticipation to create expectations and deviate from what's expected. These podcast episodes have a certain repetition to them. I pick a theme each week and develop ideas around it, and within that, there is a repetition of what I'm trying to communicate, but it's also organized into sections. It's not always the same, but I try to keep a certain form which has some wiggle room. Dividing the content into 3 or 4 sections makes it more digestible for the listener. It's not by accident. Before we go, I wanted to talk about one more example of repetition, which was in the movie The Commuter. This is This is a suspense. This is a suspense thriller. It's a suspense thriller that takes place on a commuter train. I didn't really expect much from this movie. It stars Liam Neeson, who is great, but it's that kind of movie, which I enjoy, don't get me wrong.
I will look for you. I will find you. And I will kill you.
However, the opening sequence I thought was brilliant. And it's a good example of how repetition can serve multiple purposes. Basically, the film opens with his alarm going off and him hitting snooze. Fade to black. Again, the alarm goes off, he hits the button, and for a moment you think it's like Groundhog Day. But it's a different day, and we get a slightly longer view this time. And then again, a new day, a little further along. And this goes on for a while, and each time we get a glimpse of these characters, little pieces of a puzzle, and an overall picture of a guy in a 9-to-5 job working towards his retirement and riding the train every day. The sequence as a whole builds up this tension because things are being revealed and left unresolved, and there's a rhythm to it that we can feel is leading to something consequential. We just don't know what. But in a very short amount of time, the film is able to establish these characters and set the stage for the rest of the movie by using repetition. Not exact repetition, but a kind of evolution day by day. We see the monotony of his life, and we also see the beauty of it, the relationships, the struggles. So this week, let's think about how we can use repetition in our own work. Maybe to refine something or develop it further, maybe to emphasize some part of the work, or as a way to build tension that we can deviate from. I guess you could say my missing last week was a deviation. You're welcome. That's all I've got today. Thanks so much for hanging out. Please take a moment to hit that thumbs up and subscribe. And stop by my Patreon page to catch up on Hiking with Penny. I'll catch you in the next episode. Until then, keep the flow.